And I am happy. Thanks very much for joining us for the service and you're joining us for the broadcast. Thank you very much for being here. And if you're ever in the neighborhood, ever in the Saskatoon area on a Sunday, please drop by and I promise you'll have an amazing welcome. So I am happy. I am very happy. And I'm reminded actually of a story of a couple who were celebrating their 60th wedding anniversary, and they were at a church fellowship. And everyone was getting excited, and someone asked, "Wow, what's the secret to your success?" And the wife piped up. She said, "Well, there are two secrets. The first one is open and honest communication. Like, you've really got to be communicating. You do that, and it makes all the difference in the world. And the second, travel the world." Wow. So where have you been? Well, for our 25th anniversary, we went to St. Petersburg, Russia. It was beautiful. I don't know if you know about how that city came to be, but it's just a wonder. It really is. And it was so romantic. It was just wonderful. So then someone else asked, "Well, what did you do for your 50th anniversary?" When she said, "Oh, I went back and picked him up." Anyway. So, as you can see, I like to start with something fun. Now, if you've been receiving the weekly newsletter, or the love letter, as I'm going to be calling it, you'll have read about the story of after I did the talk last week, which was wonderful. And I got to say, when I did the talk and I got to watch at the end all the hugs and just the love and the community, it was just beautiful. And I'm very excited by that. So I'm in this wonderful place, this wonderful glowy, gooey place. And I go downstairs and my car has been broken into. It's been vandalized. They've ripped off the mirror. They've wrecked the molding. And I'm standing there and I've got a friend of mine with me and we're looking at it. And they turn around and they say, "Wow, you're being quite cool about this." And I said, "Well, actually what I'm feeling is compassion. I'm feeling compassion for the person," or it turns out actually, because they've since found footage of the two guys not only breaking into my car, but also into the mechanical room. But I went to treatment. I went to treatment for them or for him at the time, because in my mind, I felt, wow, the consciousness of lack that must have been there, that illusion of separation that they had to be in that space, that's worthy of compassion. And really that is spiritual practice. You know, the spiritual practice, when things appear to go wrong, they're actually perfect. The opportunity is, do we make the choice to perceive it differently? And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the blessings of experience. It has since turned out that they found the footage. I spoke with, the insurance has been phenomenal so far, and I got the police, it was very simple. And the property manager has been great. She went through and she found, the footage and sort of phoned me back. And I was really struck by just the peace around it. Now, I don't know whether or not that's because after all this time of really telling myself to be happy, really working and doing spiritual practice, that's starting to pay off. I do feel that having stepped into this role as spiritual director, I feel that there's been a transformation for me internally. I felt there was a shift and a rite of passage when I went through and became a practitioner. When I went through the panels and they told me, okay, no, I'm a practitioner, I burst into tears actually when I was told I was a practitioner. Right there, it was 3 ministers, there was 3 ministers, and I burst into tears. I was like, "Oh, that's so exciting, I'm so glad." And it was a rite of passage. Someone's relating there. Someone was a bit teary too, yeah. There's a rite of passage. And then there was a rite of passage when I went through ministerial studies, and those 3 years, it was phenomenal. But it was life-changing, life-turning, everything was unpacked and displayed in front of me for me to see, and not always in obvious ways. And things that didn't really need to be in my life fell apart, and things that needed to come in my life came into my life. And I had these experiences that became such blessings. And when I went through the ministerial, the rite of passage of going through the arch and being blessed, and the wonderful thing, I was just totally moved. We all were. There was about 20 of us at that ceremony. And I know that I felt a shifting coming into this role, another rite of passage. So whether or not I get to be all ministerly, whatever the word would be, or ministry, in that minister consciousness, I don't know. But I believe that it's actually for everyone to make a choice to be happy. And really connecting with experience and the blessings of experience is a very important practice. In fact, I believe the blessings of experience are such that we really, I've got a frog that's dancing in my throat here. When you think about what experience is, we are all individual human beings, right? You've got a body, you've got a body, we've all got an individual body, right? And so that means that I can only be in this space at this time. I can't be where you are, or you are, or you are at this time. So we all have these unique experiences. Excuse me. So in The Science of Mind, Ernest Holmes on page 31, he says, so if you're not familiar with The Science of Mind, it's the book that our spiritual organization is centered around. And he said that experience has taught us that the subjective tendency of this intelligent law of creative force may consciously be directed and definitely used. This is the greatest discovery of all time. So I'm going to run through that again, because that's a lot of mystical truth. Experience has taught us, and the next bit goes that the subjective tendency of this intelligent law of creative force. So what he's saying, that's Ernest Holmes' it's Holmes' for saying there is this infinite creative force. You might call it God, you might call it spirit. It's subjective. It's not personal. It doesn't pick on you. There's not this God that we're praying to up in this geographical location somewhere. There is God within each and every one of us, and it's a creative force, and it's always present. So that's what he's saying. He's taught us that this creative force that's always present, that is impersonal, may consciously be directed and definitely used. May consciously be directed and definitely used. So that's really important, right? Because, that's okay, he's managing mics here. That's really important because what he's telling us is that this creative force, we can consciously direct it and we can use it. It's always in action. It's always being used by us, but we can consciously use it and direct it. So we do that for our thinking, right? And then he says, this is the greatest discovery of all time. And that's the only time he says it in The Science of Mind. That's the only time. He didn't say this is the greatest discovery of our time. He didn't say this is the greatest discovery to come or in the past. This is the greatest discovery of all time. So in a way, really those two sentences, they encapsulate the joy and the power and the magnificence of these teachings, right? So I find it interesting that the word experience is planted right in there. And I don't believe it's a coincidence. I don't believe Ernest Holmes wrote anything by accident. I believe he was being very mystically clear with and about spirit when it came to what he was writing in The Science of Mind. So when we think about each of us having this unique experience, I talk about us having these bodies, space and time, okay? So that means we each have a unique experience, which also means that in my experience is valid and true for me, and your experience is valid and true for you. Now that's central to what I'm about to talk about. In other words, everyone's experience is valid and true for them, for each of us. It doesn't matter what you say, it doesn't matter what you think. The reality is you are dealing with every person you meet is having an experience, and it's valid and true for them. So then we have perception. So what happens is we perceive the world through our experience. Now, the interesting thing with perception is tied up with things like values and beliefs, okay? Those deep-seated beliefs and values that we have. A very interesting thing when you think about I'm 44 years old now, and I'm this Caucasian male minister. I probably fit in an archetype of spiritual leader that many of you are familiar with. Because you only have to think about the Catholic priests and how they went into a lifelong period of service, that they went into service for life, and many of them were white men, okay? So there's probably not much dissonance or disagreement in that value, that perception of me as a minister. But if I was wearing a clown nose, a clown hat, and I was 85, and I was transgendered and carrying whips and chains, I might shock, right, your values. You may or may not consciously talk about that, but that may be something that challenges you, okay? So this is going on all the time, whether or not we realize it. And in psychology, there's a term called cognitive dissonance. And simply put, that is that disagreement between two ideas internally. And so what you're going to try and do is you're either going to try and deny it, confront it, or you'll change. Okay? And this happens all the time. You may not be, anytime you feel uncomfortable, you are experiencing a conflict between the ideas that you have at the level of your own values and internally, and what you're seeing, what you're perceiving, and you're experiencing. Okay, now I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not going to go any deeper than that. But simply put, that means to change our experience, we can change our perception. And what I love about Pharrell Williams' song there, Happy, if you listen to the words, that's a New Thought song. I am happy. That's he keeps coming back to that. I am happy, and we resonate with that as a community because we get that, because we know we can choose and we can affirm and say I am happy, and that's very, very powerful stuff. So I want to share with you a few little tips on how to realize the blessings of experience. Because if you think about it, if we can use our perception to change our experience, and that if everyone's experience is valid and true, that also means no experience is right or wrong, by the way. Your experience is neither right or wrong. It is your experience. So these are 5 rules. There's actually more, and we're going to be digging deeper into this in some of that leadership development training next week. So the first one is assume good intentions. Assume that everyone has good intentions until they prove otherwise. Now, I know in my personal experience, I had a relationship where I would say my intention was good a lot, and there wasn't necessarily the consistency, and that really contributed to a dissolving relationship. But that's what needed to happen. That was perfect, even if it didn't feel perfect. So sometimes assuming good intentions, particularly when we're emotionally involved with someone or something, can become hard because we've got that perception, those values, and that desire to have it go right. So then we can get into forgetting to assume good intentions. But if you can get back to assuming good intentions, it's always a really good place to start. Then own your own experience. So really what I'm talking about there is that your experience is your experience, and own it. It's valid and true. Know that it's neither right nor wrong. It's your experience, and that how you're perceiving the world has a lot to do with your experience. You know, the old saying, I got out of the bed on the wrong side. This morning I got out of the bed on the wrong side. I mean, what an anti-new thought cliche. If you think about it, that goes against what we teach. I got out of the bed on the wrong side. I got out of the wrong side of the bed this morning. I don't even know how to say it anymore. That's how much I've deprogrammed it from my mind. I got out of the wrong side of the bed this morning. So that's like saying, as if there's some chance or fatalistic idea that I happen to get out on a different side of the bed and it's all gone wrong from there. I'm not owning my own experience now. What I'm doing is I'm perceiving as if there's a power outside of me, the bed, am I getting out of it on the wrong side, that somehow has caused this bad day. I'm not owning my experience anymore. Okay? And it's very subtle. These cliches are very subtle, the way they're playing out. There's a lot of cumulative consciousness. There's a guy called Eric Butterworth who's written a book called Spiritual Economics, which I believe is going to be the first class we do in September. If you're looking at classes, we're planning on that. And I read a term where he talks about cumulative consciousness. And I love that. It's talking about the collective co-creative consciousness. What happens with economies and with nations. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So own your own experience. Honor the experiences of others. So honor the fact that they're having this unique, right, and truthful experience for them. Okay, it's neither right nor wrong. It's their experience and it's perfect. And avoid the temptation to be right. So that comes back to that idea of that dissonance, right? That kind of dissonance where how they are representing their experience and perception through their words or their actions. Now, you can't see their thoughts, but their thoughts are also contributing to what's unfolding. So how they're representing their experience and perception, how that clashes or leads to that discomfort for you. And it can be really subtle. It can be mannerisms. It can be certain ways of saying words. I get a bit of a break because I've got an English accent and I've come to North America, and apparently that's a good thing. So that's something that's an attraction. But if I had a really hard to understand accent, that would be some dissonance for you. Okay. So the idea of then telling me I need to change my accent, that's a temptation for you asking me to change so that your perception is not challenged, which is very interesting. Over the coming years in spiritual leadership, I know people are going to come up and they're going to tell me what they thought of the talk, what they thought of the class, what they thought of this, how they're thinking of me as a minister. And I'm going to know that it's actually all about them. And I'm also going to honor that their experience is their experience. I'm going to honor their experience, and I'm going to own my own experience. And that I'm going to make sure that I avoid the temptation to be right. And through guidance, I'm going to invite everyone that I come into contact with that chooses to step some of these steps with me through practice to be reminded and more clear to avoid the temptation to be right. When we do this, we tap into the blessings of experience. Because if we succumb to the temptation to be right, what happens now, we get into that conflict, whether it's internal, whether it's passive aggressive, or whether it is outwardly aggressive. We've got to be right. I believe for this community, based on what I've heard, that is a really important ground rule for us to get clear on. We've got to avoid the temptation to be right. We've got to honor the experiences of others and own our own experiences. So, and then the fifth one is be willing to understand the perception or experiences of others, but don't feel the need to give up your own experience. So really these 5 ground rules, they're really sort of weaved together. So now I want to put it a little bit concrete, in a concrete example for you on a worldly stage as to how these ground rules got broken, every single one of them. So when I was flying in yesterday, I got to go to Edmonton Airport and I'm parking my car and they've got newspapers by the desk. So I pick up a newspaper, and I like to read the news. I like to check out Google News every day. And, I do it for 2 reasons. Partially because I do like to be informed, because as a minister, I want to be able to talk about worldly events in a spiritual context. Because that's one way in which I can support you all relating to the world, okay? And maybe just share some thoughts on how I'm looking at the world. In other words, my perception and my experience. So I am looking to the news as a way to inform me so that I can make choices to change my perception of it. So in the National Post, so it's a fairly reputable newspaper, right? I would say their journalistic integrity, I would assume, would be pretty high. It's one of our national papers, right? So this was yesterday, and it's in, the article is Saddams Army loyalists behind the rise of ISIS. Now, has anyone here not heard of ISIS? So ISIL, these are the guys that are going on gals that are going through the Middle East and tearing apart Iraq and Syria. Now, here's the interesting thing. So the article is a pretty brazen, bold title. Saddam's Army loyalists, Saddam Hussein. So if you think about it, what the article then said was that back in 2003, when the US invaded Iraq and they deposed Saddam Hussein, there was an army of 250,000 men. Okay, that's the population of Saskatoon. So just think about it, like put that in context. Everyone in Saskatoon just got put out of a job. All right. Now, what they then did was they said everyone who was ranked colonel and above, you get nothing. And everyone under colonel, everyone under the rank of colonel, they said, we'll give you 1 month severance and you will automatically get a job if you choose in the new Iraqi army. So that's like saying everyone who had like a senior management position was turfed out on the street and everyone else got a job in this new organization. Can you imagine that? How would you feel about that? All right. So as they went through, the journalist then said that ISIL would not exist without Saddam being deposed. Now, this is a bit fascinating, isn't it? Because as I read that, I went, that's interesting. Now, thankfully, the journalist went and actually backed it up. And this is what they had to say. They said that the best officers in Saddam's army are actually, they represent at least 25% of the command structure of ISIL. That ISIL or ISIS have superior local intelligence. Because what happened was that these 250,000 men were supported by Saddam's regime, that was supported by oil, and there were career military men who spent 20, 30 years, that was their career, some of whom were very, very good at gathering military intelligence. Very good at it. And they know the area. So guess what? The actions of 2003, now 13 years later, are clearly playing out in being probably one of the biggest contributing factors for the military successes of ISIS. Cause and effect. Cause and effect. So when I thought about it, I thought this is interesting because, first of all, the US assumed bad intentions. Assume good intentions is rule number one. They assumed that every colonel and above would automatically be bad. So they planted the seeds of this chaos. The US, they did not own their own inexperience. So we should own our own experience, right? But they didn't own their inexperience either. They assumed that their culture, their values were right. They didn't avoid the temptation to be right. They went in and said, mission accomplished. Yeah, the only mission they accomplished was creating chaos. And the evidence is now being laid bare. Okay? And they did not honor the experience of others. So they didn't honor the experience of these commanders. And I'm sure there's a lot of good guys who are working at that rank below colonel and who are in the army and are contributing something to the stability of that nation somewhat, but actually no, they're not, because the Iraqi army is really suffering because all of their best commanders are in ISIS. And here's the thing, they spent 10, 20, 30 years being trained and gaining the experience on how to build military infrastructure, the organization, the communication, the supply lines, how to actually collaborate. All of that knowledge, all of that experience does not just fall out of a tree. And the US and the coalition partners were not willing to understand the perceptions and experience of others. The US, in effect, broke every single one of those rules. And they are now getting to reap the curse of that experience, cause and effect. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and I've talked, actually, I remember I came a year and a half ago and I talked about the Syrian chemical crisis, the Syrian war. And really what I said about war, the metaphysical perspective I have is that I honor anyone who goes into military service from the point of view that I would imagine 99 times out of 100, they are seeking to defend those who can't defend themselves. I honor that. It's a path and it's a calling and it's beautiful. It's not a path I've chosen, although interestingly, I actually did apply to join the British intelligence corps, and I was accepted. And then my mother was so freaked out about the Northern Irish conflict, she tore up the tickets. And in the end, it became, my mother prevented me from going. But I was accepted to go into the intelligence corps, and I would have been potentially a spy. Who knows? Maybe I still am. See, I wouldn't be because I wouldn't. And what's probably interesting is that GCHQ is monitoring all video streams and emails and internet traffic, and they probably picked up on the words intelligence. Yeah. So there's probably about 50 words that got flagged. Probably an analyst is probably going to be watching. Probably there'll be our ripple that will pick up this video because an analyst will then be watching it in a few hours, and I'd like to just bless you and love you. Thank you for your service. Yes, thank you for joining us. So one of the things I want to make clear though is that as a religious or spiritual leader, I'm not in the business of having a secular position. But what I'm doing is I am perceiving what's going on in the world around me and offering a perspective. It's not that I'm saying that the US invading Iraq was wrong. What I'm saying is that there are choices they made and ground rules they broke that created an experience that is causing some problems. And I don't think anyone is thinking about George Bush and Dick Cheney with love and admiration around what's going on right now. And when you look at the evidence, it's not strong. So if it's good for the National Post, it's good for me. So, experience in the creative process. So there was a widow who approached, actually in the Hebrew Bible, or what's often called the Old Testament. A widow came to Elisha. She'd been left destitute by the death of her husband. And actually, the laws of the time, their sons would be forfeit for the debt. I mean, this is in the Bible, you know, slavery and sons being forfeit for debt. No, seriously. And so she came to Elisha and she said, my husband is dead and a creditor has come to take my sons. And Elisha then said, well, what have you in your house? And the widow said, I have only one pot of oil. This is all I've got. And really what Elisha was getting at there is what's in your consciousness? What are you thinking about? What are you identifying with? You know, you've ever heard of the idea that the house is metaphysically aligned with what's inside our consciousness? So that's what this story is getting about. So what Elisha then said was, go to your neighbors and borrow additional vessels. Now, she didn't say go borrow additional oil. She said go and borrow additional vessels. And what she was advising there was to expand the mind. In other words, to broaden your horizon of consciousness. So what we would do within our community is that we'll typically say that if something is manifesting in your life that is less than feeling good, or maybe if you want more of the good, you'll go and book some time with a practitioner. You're borrowing their consciousness. You are literally going to a neighbor's house and you're going, okay, I'm going to put a vessel in here and I'm going to get some prayer support because I feel the sense that they can know for me and they can support me. I can borrow their consciousness through this. And it's a powerful practice. And the idea is that you can achieve what you can conceive. You can achieve what you can conceive. So she brought those additional vessels in, and the wisdom of that prophet was saying that if you open your mind to a bigger idea, if you can conceive more, then those vessels will be filled by spirit, by an infinite source of supply. So on Science of Mind, page 54, Ernest Holmes says, while it is true that the wrong conditions exist, So he's acknowledging it. It's true, wrong conditions exist. They could not remain unless there was someone to experience them. So while it is true that wrong conditions exist, they could not remain unless there was someone to experience them. Consequently, the experience must be in consciousness. Change the consciousness and the false condition will disappear. Change the consciousness and the false condition will disappear. And so for me, that starts to get at the heart of the vision I have, particularly over these coming months, is to build a community around spiritual practice, around spiritual nourishment. Invite anyone who cares to be involved to step in. Not everyone wants or desires to be in leadership, but let everyone know that if there's something you're interested in seeing, and we can tie it and have spiritual practice around it, then let's do that. Because as Ernest Holmes also said, it takes real vision to dare to love all, to forgive all, to condemn none, to see God as all in all. And that was my experience last Sunday. My car got broken into. I didn't condemn the thieves. I blessed them. I loved them. I honored them as the divine. And may I do that regardless of how intense the experience is or may be. Whether it comes to health, wealth, relationship, whatever it might be. May I have the real vision to, although I don't have rear vision in my car because they ripped off the rear view mirror. But anyway, may I have real vision to dare to love all, to forgive all, to condemn none, to see God as all in all. And I'd like to close by saying that I see God as all and in all of you. I love and I bless you.
Thank you.